Hi, I just want to apologize for the abrupt transition between our two speakers. So, Edem, who you've just heard, and Oliver, who's our next speaker. We had some, let's call them technical difficulties. My apologies for that. And the next voice that you'll be hearing will be Oliver's.
I'm a lawyer in Ghana, and I don't know what else. I guess that's it. I'm interested and I'm happy to be joining this conversation here today. Okay.
I mean, I feel like I'm a lawyer in Ghana doesn't really like cut
Oh,
the
well,
whole.
I'm a lawyer everywhere else.
Um,
Wherever I find myself, I guess. Yeah.
yes,
No,
yes,
but yeah, I'm definitely interested in some of the themes that we're exploring in this conversation. I think hopefully I can also offer some perspectives on them. Yeah.
great. Okay, so yes, Oliver says he's a lawyer. Um, he is many, many things. Right. So yes, we've invited Oliver here, and Oliver's also one of the founding members of Nori, which I'm going to talk about in a bit. And I invited Oliver because for me, the core of actually addressing a lot of these issues come down to so that like the issues that we're facing, a lot of it comes down to the legal and the constitution, and I do not have necessarily the knowledge and expertise um, in that department. So if we invited Oliver here for those things. So again, I sent Oliver some pre-questions to kind of start off the discussion, and then we will kind of open up the discussion. So the first question is, what are the key legal challenges hindering progress and in addressing social, economic, and environmental issues in Ghana?
Mm. Um, um, yeah. So first of all, let me say that sort of my appreciation and understanding of what law is can be a bit different from the way in which many people interact with it. And I think that the conversation about I guess the legal framework and the way in which it limits or impedes socioeconomic justice is requires a bigger reflection on the structure of power and the way in which our social institutions have been set up. Because we have to remind ourselves that law in this case is not only just legal instruments that we know, but the structure of our society as we understand it is also very law based. So whether or not in terms of how communities are set up with chiefs and chieftaincy institutions and things like that, those derive out of law. The way in which we relate to the public sphere, the way in which we relate to elected officials, the idea that we have elections in themselves are also products of law more generally. So to think about the persistence of social inequality is to more have a more broader view in terms of the basic structure of our society itself is the one we need to question as to whether or not we have designed our social institutions in the way that make it almost impossible for social inequality or economic inequality or some of those problems to continue to thrive. And I don't think that we have. One of the things as well is that even beyond not having been able to create society in a way that enhances our efforts to reduce economic and social inequality, and also the way in which it impedes us from being able to reach some of the goals we claim to set for ourselves, also requires us to reflect more deeply on whether or not law amplifies our attempts to be able to solve the social problems and some of the issues that exist. Now, to say that law structures our society is also to think about um, our society's relationship with our constitutional framework more generally. And so you can take every issue, right? Let me take from some of the most prominent conversation we have been having around environmental and things like that, you know, and you can reflect from the constitutional perspective. And one of the things our constitution does so well is being able to give us more broader principles and general aphorisms or words that claim to give us a sense that, oh, this is what our society values. But what it is immediately disables us from is that it doesn't provide a real framework for us to be able to live up to those principles or things that it claims to believe in, or things that it sets as our social values. So, one, for instance, the Constitution says that sort of the environment and resources are things that are held in trust, one, for future generations when you think about the environment, and two, in terms of our resources that exist, that it says that they are held in trust for we Ghanaians as it exists. So the question is, what is the nature of that trust? And if we are beneficiaries of a trust that exists, what is our ability as beneficiaries of a trust to be able to influence the way in which the trust is managed or set up? So it sounds well fanciful to say that, oh, like all mineral and natural resources that exist in the country are held in trust for the people of Ghana by the president. But it's unclear to us where there's a mismanagement by the trustee of that trust. What role does the beneficiaries play in managing or that trust resources? Now, the first thing is that there is no framework that exists for us now to say that we disagree in the way in which the management of that trust is set up. Okay. So we can't say in anywhere that we don't want mineral resources to be mined as beneficiaries of a trust that exists. So the bigger conversations that exist between, broader environmental concerns and the way in which, natural resources exploitation operates, we have no role as beneficiaries of that trust to be involved in the process, as a broader principle. Two, we can't say that the role for us to be able to influence how those who are given licenses and things like that to exploit natural resources, our role and influence in the process is also very limited. And more generally, the grants would happen whether or not we say yes or whether or not we like them. Two, there are no standards that determine how that trust should be managed. Absolutely not. The trustee, through the Attorney General, can then sponsor legislation and says, this is how I want to be able to do it, and the court would uphold it. Because it's assumed that the trustee has our best interest at heart, and we just have to shut up and take it as it is. So we can set up we have a legal system which I feel generally does not provide a true mechanism for how we the people can control the decisions that are made on our behalf and how they are made. And so you might take some of the terms that are thrown about more liberally, like, we are custodians of sovereignty, that the sovereignty resides in us, the people. But then what does that mean? Like, what ways in which in our daily governance systems can we seize and exercise that sovereignty? There's no framework for that. So I think the broader question of how you set up society and what you're trying to achieve with it demands a reconfiguration of our entire constitutional setup to make it more aligned to values that we proclaim to believe in. When we say the environment is the legacy or the patrimony of future generations, how do we safeguard that on behalf of future generations? Can a pregnant woman, for instance, say that I have an unborn child, which is in vitro, and for which reason I'm coming to enforce future rights or so tomorrow's generation rights in terms of providing and protecting the environment for? It doesn't exist. So if we want to move the document beyond mere rhetoric, it demands that we are more intentional in allowing the people we claim that it serves to have a more direct influence in the processes of things that have supposedly been set up for them. Now, I understand that in terms of how I'm proceeding, again, it can sound a bit, how do you call it? A bit philosophical, for lack of a better word. But I'm hoping that you're staying with me because I want to challenge you in thinking about the things that we say and take for granted, but that there's really no framework for how we actually actualize some of these things. And I think that's a big problem in itself. That in many ways you expect that, well, you can say that the constitution cannot provide for everything. And that, subsequent laws that are made in the society and institutions we set up would be able to actualize those principles. But let's remind ourselves that um, what we have in essence is we have set up a democracy without democrats. The people themselves that we have put in place do not believe in the ideal and the values that these things are claiming for themselves. And so if the expectation is that persons who do not believe in that are the ones who are supposed to set it up and its implementation processes, we ought to ask our question that does the Constitution anticipate that there are going to be people who would come up and will not actualize the words of the Constitution? And in that case, what happens? For instance, the Constitution says immediately after the coming into force of the Constitution, there ought to have been an affirmative action bill passed. Okay, it was passed this year. And the only reason why it was passed this year, after over 30 years, is because it was an IMF conditionality. So those it had placed responsibility on to take lead on it would not do it until a foreign, institution where they're going to seek a loan makes it a condition for the loan that they seek. So the accountability of these persons, even to the Constitution itself, and to we the people, is non-existent. And when it's non-existent, we have no particular framework to make sure that it comes into reality, more generally. So yeah, I mean, these are introductory kind of reflective thoughts I would have on that, Andrea.
Whew. Okay.
Have I made you
I
tongue?
don't even know where to start. Okay. Okay. While I gather my thoughts on what you've just said, let me move on to the second question. How do you feel like citizens can challenge these constitutional injustice or limitations that effectively limit their rights? I think, yeah, let me just ask the question.
Yeah. So, in some way, this question is as well linked to the first, and I'll explain. What mechanisms of challenge does the Constitution provide for we the people, for the citizens in the first place? Okay. So, primarily, one of the things that I hear people say often is that you can vote people out, and that's the first mechanism of challenging. But the reasons why people go to the polls, so it's varied and almost unimpeachable, that it's very difficult to be able to tie a direct connection between the absence or the inability to provide certain social goods and how they exercise the franchise. So the vote itself is the most ineffective way of being able to ensure citizens to challenge or to ensure accountability in the first place. Then the second thing is, well, you can go to court, I guess. Okay. Now, that presumes that you're able to find a neutral arbiter in the courts, that it exists. And one of the things I've kind of realized about the ingenuity of the Ghanaian politician is understanding the ease with which the Constitution has created a framework for state capture. And so for all the institutions that have been set up in which you can take your plaints to, you've quickly figured out that the way in which we can be able to deal with that is one, directly appointing party cronies to all those institutions and filling them up. And with that, quickly enough, you can be able to, you can be able to neutralize their effects. And secondly, and perhaps the one we don't notice easily, is the reproduction of administrative processes. So when you raise a public issue, let's say police have done something, right? And you can complain about the Ghana police, The first thing people say is that, but have you reported it to the police? Okay. Now that question does not take into account whether or not the police itself are behind the violence, or that people's lived realities of the police is that they report cases to the police, and the police says, if you don't bring me money, I'm not going to go. But one of the ways in which you can undermine the legitimacy of a complaint you have is that you have not complied with a particular administrative process. And those administrative processes can be repetitive or increase how many way you like it. So even if you and it's everywhere of our lives, the way in which the our institutions function. So even if I went to court and I lost in court and the judge was horrible or took a bribe, the next thing is that, but why didn't you appeal the decision? So there's always something new that you should be able to comply with, which are like meaningless procedures that we keep replicating for you to continue to follow, and we keep following it. But that requires a broader critique of the way in which we set up the administrative state. But yeah, the easier thing we have done, and which is more palpable, is the control of those mechanisms for which you can think about um, entering. And then the third thing is that, well, perhaps you can petition Parliament, the People's Assembly, we call it, right? So immediately once you do that, the Parliament is going to send you a fine letter and say to you that, no, you can't send us a petition. You can give the petition to an MP, and then the MP can bring it before us. So you have no direct input into the process and the way in which Parliament speaks. It has to be laundered through somebody who, whether or not the person takes it, the person is not obliged to take it up, though, as your representative. And if they don't take it up, we have no way to impeach the person who doesn't take it up. Okay. So then ultimately, the only way in which citizens are left to be able to weigh into the political conversation or the challenge you talk about is ultimately what? The streets, protests. But we all know that there's no constitutional or any institutional framework in any country that provides protest as an administrative remedy to a problem you have. It's not, right? Like, for instance, I give this example where if somebody stole something from you, you go to the police as an administrative remedy. So they catch the person. We're supposed to go to court for whatever. But the protest, it leads nothing. There's no promise of anything, and there's no expectation, and nobody is bound to do anything in respect of it. And so you are left with the continuous conversation of raising public awareness or trying to guilt those you have elected into believing that there's an urgent thing to be addressed here. And I think we can all see the beauty of how politicians can ignore us. And they can ignore everything, including a protest, in many ways. So there are all these strands of things which we think that, oh, this makes us a democracy because these are avenues to be able to build up challenge and power. But the state is set up in a way that minimizes their potential and effect. But it means also, it requires then that we are more creative and more reflective in the ways in which we can be able to sustain and gather public attention and be able to generate mass action on many issues. And we can take the recent, again, Galamsey conversation as an example, that our ability to sustain and hold conversation on an issue is directly linked to how long the media might stay with us or how quickly they might follow Afenyo Market into the Supreme Court, and then we'll be engaged in a conversation for a month over meaningless, whether or not who should be majority and minority in the parliament that is not going to do anything forever. And it has a potential to shift the conversation. And now completely all we've been talking about is who is who and speaker said what, and that's it. There's no productive value, even in the face of an environmental crisis that we are facing. Our ability to be so distracted can be so easily weaponized against us. So there are simple gestures we can do, and those gestures have a limited potential. But it's not always the same in many constitutional democracies. And I give the example of Kenya, where unlike us who cannot initiate a direct constitutional reform action, where, for instance, constitutional reform is reserved to parliament and the executive, in Kenya, citizens can stand up and sign petitions and sign signatures and provoke an amendment referendum immediately, direct action, influencing that process. That, for me, is the opening that ought to happen and gets back to, reforming the document to be able to open up the avenues for which we can be able to, we as the people can exercise more direct control over our politics. So that's one framework. There's no mechanism to have there's no requirement even for parliament to be consultative or bring other opinions on board in terms of lawmaking process. Or no law can be invalidated because parliament did not have enlarged public hearings and sittings before it passed the law. We don't have that. In America, for instance, the courts have held the extent of consultativeness in the process or lack of can be a basis for even invalidating law. But we don't have that. Then also you have the um, um, how do I call it? In California, for instance, where we have what we call the recall elections, which is that you have elected a representative to parliament, and you're like, why has some judge spent his entire time going after the gays? And for which reason we need to recall him because he's not speaking to our constituent needs. There is no process, to do that. So unless the document is intent, some of our laws are listed are intentional about ways in which the people can be capacitated to have a direct control and come back into the process, and we are only going to be relying on institutions that can be easily captured, then it weakens our ability to be able to intervene in so many things. And then the last point I'll give as well is also, for instance, if we take the issue of prosecutions, right? Like so many of us may be frustrated that either Cecilia Dapa or somebody else is not being prosecuted, but we can't intervene. It has to be an attorney general's mandate or initiative. But we used to have something we call private prosecutions, for instance. And so when you take out like the cases of things that the disparity between reports to the police and matters that are prosecuted, a lot of the times the issues that don't get prosecuted are crimes against women, rape, sexual harassment, things like that. But if women have the right to initiate private prosecutions, you best believe that they can initiate collective actions, they can organize, whether raise funding and things like that, to be able to themselves take up the prosecution of violence against women, which is under prioritized by the states. That's an example. So yeah, there are ways in which the people can mobilize, but I'm showing you the ways in which law also can better position the people to deploy their collective action or enterprises to make it even more effective in achieving the ends that we wanted to achieve as well. Yeah.
So it seems to me that we have laws that are very good at keeping us quiet or keeping us immobilized, like to kind of
Yeah.
like you can kind of go through, because I know, like, for example, based on when you guys were arrested, you and your fellow jailbirds were arrested, and the lack of almost like we don't know what to do next, right? So it's like, okay, A, B, and C has happened, but what's next? Like there's no kind of flow chart or no kind of natural step in trying to gain that justice. And so before you joined, right at the beginning, we were discussing the definition of democracy, and we're kind of throwing all these different definitions around. And I shared this example that I found in the Journal of Democracy. Who knew there was a Journal of Democracy? And I don't know if you can see it. I'm going to highlight the section there, and it's called Modern Political Democracy is a system of governance in which rulers are held accountable for their actions in the public realm by citizens, acting indirectly through the competition and cooperation of the elected representatives. So, if we're going by this definition of democracy, it seems as though our reality in Ghana doesn't reflect this, because there are not actual systems in place where you can hold these rulers to account in the public realm as citizens. So how do we? Sorry, I feel like I'm putting the whole of Ghana on your shoulders here, but I feel like you feel like that every day. So who knows? How do we actually? How do we get there? I don't foresee politicians or power holders being like, you know what? Yeah, let's stop this, right? And one of the things that I've always maintained is people who benefit from oppressive structures are not going to be the ones to break down those structures. So it's almost like, what do we do? Like, how do we actually get from point A to point B?
So one thing, and let me stay on the democracy thing a bit before I go to the next point that you mentioned, that one of the things that we've been successful and we keep emphasizing to our citizens is this direct linkage between our democracy is voting that we create. So the feeling generally is that to be democratic is to vote, and that's what our democracy is. And so because we reduce it to electoral politics and not much more than that, it's created, I guess, um, this false sense, and you hammer you I mean you identified it very well. This false sense that we are in fact able to mobilize, we're in fact in control, but we are not. We are immobilized, and we have come to accept that all we have to do the barest minimum. We show up and vote, and that's it. That's an indication that we are in control of our democracy, whatever it is. And as long as that is the only way, in fact, an election is the employment letter of the political elite, right? So when we are showing up to vote, in fact, we are writing somebody a new check to do that. We are not, in fact, holding accountable in the true sense of the word. So it has to be problematizing the way in which we put elections. And it showed, for instance, the latest Afrobarometer survey said 80% of Ghanaians believe that they'll show up to vote, and only 5% say they will go for a protest. So the system does so well in making you feel that our democracy is electoral and nothing more than that. And that requires education, that requires intentional education to be able to change. Now, the question is whether or not we're getting that education within our classrooms. We're not necessarily getting that. And it's not a bad thing because the system is intentionally designed to create that feeling of how you participate in the process. And so you might have even an NCCE, which is supposed to civic educate us. And the NCCE's biggest budget is spent around educating you on how not to waste your ballot, so that how you vote properly. So civic education, the biggest budget they spend is also still about elections, more generally. So yeah, there's the education is the biggest framework to do that. But education that deconstructs our relationship with power a bit more, and in terms of how we view that relationship, I think it's missing. I feel that in terms of our public discourse and the serious ways in which power reacts to us or reinforces inequality and things like that, we are not very good in spotting it. And we are very good in jumping onto the narrative of sort of the law and order narrative that the state uses to oppress, more easily than anything. I was just having a conversation today with some folks in Mozambique, the crisis that is ongoing in Mozambique, and so many people have been killed after elections have been disputed in Mozambique. And very quickly, so many people have been killed. But the media has kind of shifted the conversation into, in the protest, some individuals went to loot some shops. So the whole conversation has turned into, these people are not true protesters. They are looters and they are criminals. And we are easy to be able to fall into those traps and narratives of where all we have to identify is one bad nut and shift the conversation to them and say, this is representative of how bad we Ghanaians are. An example is this recent conversation about somebody who was selling under the bridge, right? The interchange. And it's like, Ghanaians have done their thing again. We Ghanaians are our own problem, right? So we are looking for these things to be able to shift, and make ourselves the problem and believe it's almost like being in an abusive relationship where you always feel made to feel like you're not enough and you are the problem constantly. You're constantly second guessing yourself. And that's kind of how our relationship with the state works. Now, how do we do that? Yes, it's political education. There's very little avenues and access for people to educate themselves politically, to be a bit more reflective about the way in which the state reacts in our lives, about the continuation of the colonial project from those who have proclaimed independence for us and their relationship with it, and the way in which they stepped into the colonizers' shoes and how it affects us to this day. We don't have enough of those avenues. I guess if there were, Nori would not be seeking to enter into a space where it is very political political education heavy and reform our relationship with the political thing. That's the first one. Two, I give 3 points. Two, we make this mistake constantly in terms of thinking that um, the more degrees is reflective of a person who has a social understanding of what the you know common or public goods we ought to get and the way to get them. Okay, but we know constantly that even in some of our highest institutions, whether you take the mining commission, you take the forestry commission, and things like that, all the PhDs, their reaction and relationship with power is one of fear. People are mighty protective of I might lose my job. Now, a person whose relationship is so defined by I ought to please the politics, it doesn't matter what degrees they have, they do a disservice to you no matter whatever space they have. So there's an absence of, you know, courage and principle that ought to be more definitive of how those who are within the public space ought to react than they are more generally. And I can see it permeates every aspect of our lives, right? It permeates the ways in which we have ended up in this environmental crisis because even when people have gone to the police to complain about galamsey or whatever it is, you're more likely than not to expect that nothing would happen if the person who show up is regional chairman of NPP or something. It happens on that level. It happens in the courts where the a court would be apprehensive or less likely to rule against the state because the state is involved and hey, you know, I'm afraid of what might happen to her. So that absence of it is not more education, but the one that requires that there's virtue in suffering the consequences of speaking up for good. There's some virtue in that. That's missing. So we are all avoidant, or we are all trying to create a situation whereby we can most protect ourselves and jobs and things like that if we don't speak up against injustice. So much so that in our space now, you can have climate or environmental activists or whatever it is, NGOs and things like that. But a politician will always be more respected than they are. It doesn't, we respect power more than those who are seeking to course correct. I would say. And then the final thing is we have seen clearly that the problem is our low levels of organization and mobilization that happens. And so in previous times past, for instance, when we were arrested and free the citizens, that mobilized effort happened. So many people would have said, but Ghanaians did not do anything or would not have done anything prior. But we are seeing these signs of organizing and mobilizing that is happening in reaction to things which would not have happened in the past. And when we have seen, as a given example, when we have seen like activism and things like that died from the universities, which used to be the case in the 80s, now, for the first time, we are seeing people using the tool of Twitter and things like that, or in the general population, who are organizing around different themes. For the first time, to be able to see conversation on the scale like this, which is happening where young Ghanaians have mobilized around an environmental issue of this significance, it's interesting to me, you know. And even though you have had like the school boycotts and in children, protesting climate and other things happening in Europe and other places, and it feels like the conversation has almost messed up, you see the loop come back again with what has happened recently and being willing to step out and organize more. So I think that more organization, avenues for education, and redefining our relationship with power through being more courage driven, these three things can perhaps push us forward in terms of what we are trying to achieve, I would say.
I mean, I like that that's your answer for obvious reasons. Yeah, I think for me, the education part and the point that you made about the universities, historically being the place where activism sort of really grows, is something that I've observed kind of across the board. So, like, my PhD looks at the experiences of undergraduate students, but I have a whole section that talks about the fact that, like, in the UK, for example, we call it the marketization of education, where education, a degree level education became accessible to everybody. You can get a student loan, you can go to university. and which is great in lots of ways. But the fallout of that is it's created this kind of, I'm paying for you to teach me, therefore, like I want to get this sort of school level quality of teaching. And there seems to be a lack of understanding of the role of university in society, because the people that would typically go to university, the demographic that would typically go to university now have changed. And so it's kind of almost diluted what universities do. And the same thing in America, actually. So when you see the recent protests in America, they're doing the protest on Palestine. The discourse has become, you're meant to be there to study. This isn't what you're supposed to be doing at university.
Mm.
But
Mm.
actually, that is what
Mm.
university is supposed to do. It's supposed to shape
Mm.
society, whatever field and whatever kind of sector it is that you're in. So for me, for example, it's early childhood and education. And you and I had the conversation about Frere's book, Education for Critical Consciousness, and he talks a lot about this kind of civic level of education, but very grassroots, educating the public to
Mm.
grasp the a critical understanding of their reality, and then almost how to advocate for themselves is kind of the easiest way that I can do it. I did have a whole section of presentation where I was going to break down what we're doing at Nori, but just because of time, I'm going to skip that whole part out. But that is our, I say our because Oliver's our board member, and our strategy for the next year for 2025 is putting together this kind of civic education format and trying to figure out the best way to do that. So, if you are somebody that is interested in supporting us and putting that together, you can do so financially, but also as a contributor, because trying to spread this information, whereas typically this knowledge would be exclusive to the university, I think we can utilize, as Eden was saying, we can utilize the media, we can utilize TikTok and YouTube and all of these other platforms to provide this civic education. Because I think for me, there's almost like a cultural, like you said, there's like a cultural, like an abusive relationship with the state, right? Where it's like, it's almost like you deserve your oppression because you haven't followed the rules. And
Mm.
I'll give an example. When you were arrested, there was this whole thing that kept dominating the discussion that Oliver took the keys.
Mm.
And it was driving me up the wall. And I'm like, did you like not see like the whole context of the situation? But you believe that somebody removing a key is worse than that the worst thing that has happened in Ghana since we gained independence or something, is so reflective of like this sort of obedient, I don't want to use the word citizen, like just obedient thing that exists in this space to be manipulated. And I think that's where that weaponized poverty thing comes in. And even in some of the diaspora groups that I was in, that discussion about the woman under the flyover sort of crept in. And it was pretty much exactly what you're saying. And I was so surprised to see it coming from like non-locals, I would say.
Mm.
We never want to have anything nice and all, like it's this very weird, like I don't know the word to use. It's very this weird undercurrent of like you can always sit back and laugh at somebody and everything is okay. So the media will keep throwing these completely irrelevant, like who's the majority and who cares? We have an election in like less than 20 days, right? Who's it like going to court for this and going to court for that, and all of these different distractions are anyway. I don't want to go on a whole rant. Um, so I think what would be, just because time has completely just flown by now. Do you want to add anything before I open up for people to
I've seen,
ask the panel?
in the context of opening up, do open up. I've seen Kuku's question about, she says the legal education many of us received really address systemic oppression and what can be done to legal education itself. And with the young lawyers at the bar to improve education systems of justice. Have you found any of these successful with the lawyers you have worked with or supervised, right? And I'll start with, if there's any indication or show that the legal education is intended or isn't intended to be able to address questions of oppression. It's reflected on what we say, who are those who are qualified and deserve to be at the bar are. And if there's any bigger example of that is when, I'm a governor identified themselves as being openly queer. You know, and then that became disqualifying of somebody who deserves to be at the bar, for instance. And there's no reflection of law's rule in these questions about social denial and whatever it is. And also, even in terms of how they prepare them, things they say to them, you're not supposed to be taking a trot. You're supposed to hold yourself this way. Even in terms of the way we dress in court, the reason why it persists is because it is a marker of a distinction between us and them. The way in which language we use between my learned friend and those who are not lawyers cannot call themselves learned and things like that is a consistent reiteration, at least in the minds of those who the profession deems worthy of itself, that this is what you ought to view yourself at. And the society begins to internalize that very quickly. And so, for instance, even if it is myself going out for a protest, they'll be like, but you, a lawyer, why are you joining the protest? It is that, no, lawyers don't go for protest. This is for poor people who go for protest. You have to, there's certain markers that the profession has been designed to create a feeling of, to other yourself and put yourself above somebody else, Now, that is only diagnosing the problem, which you've already done. The question, how do we fix it? That in my case, I've considered the reason why the law firm was established is also that it was supposed to be a microcosm of an approach to challenge and change people. That it was a continuation of some of the ideas of systemic reform that we were pursuing. So that bringing young lawyers in, first of all, challenging their relationship with capital and money is a big one, because the feeling and consistent one that you are made to feel as a lawyer is that you are there to make money. And that's the first point where we are trying to break down and attack within people's mind. Two is also introducing them to diverse clientele that they might not necessarily have ever worked with or ever work with in different spaces. We are intentionally in seeking out unpopular clients or persons who work in spaces on issues which are those who the most socially desirable the system stigmatizes or deprioritizes as well. So that in terms of who you are constantly being made an advocate for, it has to be persons who are particular social class. And then we're introducing people as well to deal with people and questions of oppression or system, this thing that they will not ordinarily be introduced to in their social lives, and put them in situations of discomfort. The whole firm experience is created in a way in which it is made expressly clear to you from the beginning that you are a different kind of lawyer, and we're intending a different kind of training and experience for you to have there at the firm. Even in terms of something as simple as the how do you call it, speaker series that we have at our firm, for instance, is also to introduce people to non-legal careers and non-legal perspectives more generally. One of the ones I loved most was somebody who dropped out of law school, in order to re-emphasize the feeling, even among our lawyers, that a person can drop out of law school and yet be a high-valued member of our society because they are solving other social problems in the way in which, the legal education reinforces other feelings. But and talk about the difficulties, one of the ones which I found the most difficult to cure is naturally the relationship with money and capital, and feeling like we ought to be making money, things like that. It's a difficult one. And you might ask me, what is the connection with that? Don't forget that the question, those who suffer the most oppression, one tends to be persons of a socioeconomic class which are underserved, so they don't have the money to pay for. They're also in areas of practice, for instance, criminal and other areas of practice, or human rights law, environmental, and things like that, where you receive the least money for. And so when you're convinced immediately that I need to be in insurance or other, all those, parts of the legal service industry, which are more financially rewarding, then you're already casting a particular relationship with how money as well reinforces systems of oppression more generally. So that is a constant one that we are continuing to deal with. But at the very least, I feel like those who are at the firm understand, obviously, that this is not a usual law firm and that there's something different here and it is intentionally created that way. But I feel like it's continuing to be something that we will have to continue to work at to be able to produce the kind of lawyers we get. Incidentally, I don't know, for whatever reasons, a lot of young lawyers express, or those who are coming out from the schools express an interest in coming to the firm and working there. And I think that a lot of that is, many of them are interested in somebody who, or some firms which are trying to challenge the status quo in some way. So I think the interest in joining the firm itself, we are seeing a shift, which is perhaps an indication of something good. For the amount of interest we get for a relatively young firm, it's quite interesting and surprising, and I would say,
So we're opening up for questions now. So you can put your hands up if you have questions or put them in the chat. I know, Adam, you had a couple of things that you wanted to say, so I'm going to come back to you in a second. But Oliver, I've got a question. My interests obviously lies in like children's rights and things like that. So if I was to use that as an example in terms of compelling international courts to maybe address something that, let's say, again, I'm saying, so let's say, for example, the impact on unborn children and children's health, etc. We are part of the UNCRC, and as the reality is, UNCRC is not legally binding. It's a fluff piece at best. But we are members of the UNCRC. How could we leverage that as a starting point, as in like there's a violation of children's rights in general in Ghana, to be honest, because I think one of the things when we were having like the LGBT conversation, and people are like, oh yeah, protect the children. I'm like, you don't care about the children when you're driving past them in traffic and they're there like, barefoot begging you for food and you're sending them away and shouting at them and swearing at them. You don't care about the children then. So in terms of the violation of children's rights as a platform for launching maybe some of these, obviously addressing those inequalities for children, but addressing some of these broader legal challenges, do you feel like that's something that, sorry, I feel like I'm putting you on the spot, but I feel like, is that something that could happen?
So, perhaps because I'm primarily an international lawyer, I am more suspicious of these international forums than I think that generally we are. And I understand, in terms of general advocacy and things like that, we find some reassurance if the provincial or domestic complaints we have gain some broader international audience. There's some win we feel in that. Okay. But I want to talk about two things. The first one less direct, and the second one more direct. The less direct one is, I remember a scene from Hotel Rwanda, where as these images are going out, somebody had asked, but like if America sees this or the world sees this image, of course, surely they're going to do something about it. And the person replied, yeah, they're going to be at their dinner table. They might raise their head and say, oh, this is terrible, and then go off and go on and eat their dinner. We have to be mindful of that. In the same way in which you and I continue to eat our dinner when we see the images of Gaza, just remember that other people are eating their dinner even as they watch us go by.
Yeah.
The second one is that the international courts or these platforms, what they can do is also to give audience to something. It can be a continuation of advocacy by another means to be able to bring them to the public attention, but they have less bite One, in terms of all those things that go on beyond many of these courts, Ghana or many of these countries choose whether or not to even respond or
Mm.
interested in it. Whatever decisions that come out of that, there's no mechanism to enforce it.
Yeah.
And so yeah, there's nothing that can be done, about it. Um, so
But do you feel
international
like,
sounds good. Yeah.
sorry to cut you, I feel like Ghana has this thing where it likes to look good on the public stage. So I feel like even just for that kind of, hey, this case has been brought against the Ghana government on the public stage, whether or not it would yield legal change, do you feel like the pressure of that would be enough to um
Yeah. Well,
do
it
something?
reminds me of, I guess what you're saying. It reminds me of there was an article which said that Professor No One is reading you, which is to emphasize that so many of the publications that were made in journals and stuff gets less read as compared to blogs.
Of course, yeah.
And I feel like a lot, I don't know how many people are taking an international court decision and reading it internationally,
Mm,
as compared to, say, a BBC article, for instance.
mm,
So a BBC article might have maybe wider scope than even a decision of an international court. And I say this as well to maybe in some regard best the bevel of all these international courts that exist feel like, oh yeah, by virtue of we issuing a decision, that's it. People are going to respect us more. The very few people know about them more
mm.
generally. But also, yes, it's a currency that I hear people say a lot that we need to exploit the sensitivity of our leaders to bad coverage internationally, and that we need to exploit more. Um, it hasn't. I don't know. One thing which we can say that because of the public international exposure and attention, we've course corrected.
Mm.
Surely, Galamsey sounds bad, right? The conversation around the use of some of these heavy metals and the way in which they might find themselves into cocoa pods and things like that have gone on for quite some time. I think that there is some truth in it, but also there's a limited scope in that. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's a valid question as to what role they can play as well, and what are we looking for.
Mm.
So, for instance, in terms of this conversation about the recent arrest, obviously we're going to sue the state. But let's remember the first experience from last year when we sued the state.
Mm.
So we sue the state, let's say on Monday, the case is fixed for Thursday. We show up on Thursday, the court doesn't sit. Then, unknown to us, we write to the court and say, give us a new date by which we are supposed to come. The matter is fixed for the next Tuesday. We were not in court, and so the judge says, whatever, 40, whatever, have sued the state on human rights. I've struck it out because you are not clearly not interested. Less than a week, the court says they have struck it out. And this is in the human rights court. That already gives you an indication of where this is going. Well, it's been a year. We haven't moved past anywhere yet on that matter.
I guess it
Uh,
doesn't apply to treason charges though.
yes, yes. Yes, of course. And then you have a court which are saying, like let's take the case of Benjamin, who was never even at the protest. And then, the state presents you and you don't even have anything to say. The judge says, in the interest of public interest, I am remanding you. um, you know. So
God.
this is the conception of what is in the public interest as well. So because of all those, the ways in which we see lack of independence and things like that before the domestic courts, and it's not like we are hoping for money ensuing. We are hoping for that law changes. The law is more protective of activists and things like that. We are not getting it. So when we are going internationally, we have to redefine what we are seeking to do internationally. If we are seeking for direct law change, it is less proximate, it's less likely to happen. But if it is continuation of our advocacy through a different means, that surely yes. But let's be realistic about law. And I say this also primarily because some of us within this space can easily be so captivated by law and lawyers and things like that and think that law provides justice or that our activism must freeze because we are in court. And I think we've fallen victim to that on so many occasions. We ought to be very mindful of these courts and whose court it is we have appeared and ceded our voice to when we are there. And one of the things which, for me, it is important, even as even in terms of some of the environmental litigation we're seeing going on in the court or whatever it is, understand that there's more action to be gained outside the courts and in the courts. And I give this an example. Like, for instance, I see Daryl on the call. We've brought this, legal action on behalf of Arusha and others regarding mining in Forest Reserve. We haven't moved. We're back in court on the 3rd of December. We haven't moved far, but because of the protests, because of the way Oliver went to remove the police key, we were able to keep the conversation still within the public domain for so long that they're saying, okay, we are going to withdraw the bill, the airline and things like that. That we ought to see the courts only as part of the strategy and not the end of the strategy. So yeah, that's kind of what I would say about how we ought to use it.
Yeah.
Let me perhaps take Tessa's question here, which I think it's a brilliant question as well. About, she's saying somebody has asked about whether the 53 had legal support, and then she's wondering, does legal representation even knowing the law offer enough protection to activists in Ghana? Absolutely. I mean, we can all say absolutely not. In this case. But yeah, I've even advocated, particularly in distinct communities, that in working class communities, that claiming or knowing the law can even be more dangerous to you than ignorance of it, because with ignorance you put yourself in a position where your relationship to the police is one of, please, I beg you, show me benevolence. With knowing the law gives you a false sense of confidence, of entitlement. But that would only work if the persons were ceding to that entitlement and recognizing the role of the law. They already knew the law when you didn't. And if they were inclined to respect it, they would have already. But yeah, that's the strange situation which we're caught in.
Gosh, okay. I have so many questions, but time. Okay, I see.
I'm sorry to depress you folks as well.
No. I think for me,
but I mean, even in terms of
reassuring.
Even in terms of depressing you, once we are done, you can play the video of me removing the key. I think it can lift people's spirits, and we can go on from there.
No, I'll just send it around to everybody. But no, it's actually reassuring in lots of ways, because it shows that almost the things that I'm trying to do are on the right track. Because ultimately, it's still going to come down to education. When we're talking with Eden, we were talking about the utilization of the media, and one of the things that we did whilst you guys were locked up was obviously kept the hashtag going, etc. But then other platforms began to pick it up. So like international platforms began to pick it up. And then like some like random viral TikTok people started talking about it. And if we're able to sort of build that momentum, I think that plays a role. But ultimately the education side of it, because you have pointed out that knowing the law is, can work against you if you if you're stuck on some street somewhere with policemen somewhere. And the very sort of the harsh reality of, like, if you get arrested, for example, not even being able to notify your family and your friends and your lawyer, and a very blatant blocking access to your lawyer, which is like such a fundamental thing, happened, and everybody knows that it happens. So like you said, you can't really rely on the law. Yeah. But anyway.